A crowded church hall held more than mourners that day. It carried grudges, envy, and secrets that waited to explode. When the lawyer began unfolding the truth, each revelation struck harder than the last until one moment left the entire family speechless. Like this story if you want more, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and comment where you're watching from and which part you think will change everything. Angela Johnson was a young black single mother who had spent the last 7 years fighting to keep her dignity intact while raising her son Isaiah in the heart of Georgia, a place where her family's name carried weight, but her presence often felt like an unwelcome reminder of choices the others disapproved of. She parked her rusted sedan in the crowded lot outside Mount Olive Baptist Church, the sound of its muffler rattling against the polished quiet of luxury SUVs and gleaming Cadillacs lined up like trophies of success. She sat still for a moment, watching as relatives dressed in black silk and tailored suits filed into the church, their heads held high, their shoes clicking against the pavement, their expressions composed in a way that seemed less like grief and more like a social gathering where appearances meant everything. She squeezed Isaiah's hand, the little boy fidgeting beside her in a suit that was one size too big, his small shoes freshly polished, though scuffed at the toes, his wide brown eyes looking up at her with a mixture of nervousness and trust. "Come on, baby," she whispered, forcing her shoulders straight. "We're here to honor your great-granddaddy. That's all that matters." The air was thick with judgment before she even reached the church steps. She heard the whispers drift toward her, words coated in sugar but sharp enough to cut. "Look at her rolling up in that junkyard car," one cousin muttered under her breath, clutching her designer purse tighter. "Always was a charity case. Can't believe she even showed her face today." Another voice snickered in response. "She probably thinks she's in the will. Lord knows the only thing she's getting is a plate of food." Their laughter followed Angela as she climbed the steps, her chin lifted but her heart aching. She had been mocked before, mocked when Isaiah's father left, mocked when she moved back into the small apartment her paycheck from the diner could barely cover, mocked when she showed up at family reunions with store-brand sodas instead of bottles of wine. But there was something different about today. Today was about her grandfather, the man who had told her as a child that she was stronger than she believed, the man whose rough hands had carried her when she skinned her knees and whose voice had whispered that her worth would never be defined by others. Inside the church, the smell of lilies and polished wood mixed with the faint perfume of the women who leaned against each other in the pews, whispering about outfits and cars, their voices more about gossip than grief. Angela guided Isaiah to a seat near the back, the whispers trailing behind them like shadows. She tried to focus on the music, on the choir that filled the sanctuary with hymns that spoke of hope and eternity, but her attention was pulled back to the present by the constant sting of disapproval. Her Uncle Charles, broad-shouldered, gray hair trimmed neatly, turned in his pew just enough to give her a look of disdain. He leaned toward another relative and said with a smirk that carried far enough for Angela to hear, "There goes our little charity case." Guess she thinks sitting here makes her family again. The people around him chuckled softly, their eyes flicking back at her, then forward again as though it were sport to belittle her. Angela tightened her grip on Isaiah's hand, whispering in his ear, "It's okay, baby. Just sit quietly." The service went on with speeches about legacy and honor, about a man who had worked the soil and built the Johnson home with his bare hands, about faith and family and responsibility. Angela sat in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks not just for the man she had lost, but for the family that had decided she no longer belonged. She thought about the afternoon she had sat on the porch swing with her grandfather, his voice telling her stories about strength and survival, about how Johnson blood meant resilience, not pride. She held on to those words like a shield as the preacher closed the Bible and the pallbearers prepared to lead the casket out into the hot Georgia air. In the fellowship hall afterward, tables sagged under the weight of fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and sweet potato pies. The sound of laughter filled the space as people swapped stories, but Angela stood apart with Isaiah, aware of the stares that landed on her like gnats in summer heat. She tried to make a plate for her son, tried to ignore the cutting remarks. Her Uncle Charles approached, his sweet tea glass sweating in his hand, his mouth curled in the kind of smile that wasn't kind at all. "So you came," he said in a low drawl that dripped with contempt. "Guess you figured maybe you'd hear your name in the will. Hate to tell you, but men like him don't leave nothing for women like you." Single mothers don't inherit legacies, they just take handouts. The words slammed against Angela like a blow, but she refused to show it. She stood straighter, her voice calm, though her chest burned. "I came to pay my respects," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "That's all," Charles chuckled, shaking his head as if amused by her audacity. "Sure you did," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Don't get your hopes up. Only embarrassment's waiting for you." He turned back toward the crowd, his laughter joining theirs as if he had delivered some grand joke. Angela's heart pounded, but she refused to shrink. She turned her gaze toward the corner of the room where the family lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, stood with his leather folder tucked under one arm. His expression was calm, professional, but just as Charles delivered his final insult, the lawyer's eyes lifted and locked with Angela's. For a moment, she saw something flicker there, something not pity, not judgment, but knowledge. His gaze lingered only a second before he turned away to speak with another relative, but in that second, Angela felt something shift. The fellowship hall still buzzed with chatter, the smell of fried chicken lingering in the air as Angela guided Isaiah toward a corner table, hoping to keep him fed and distracted while the relatives circled like hawks. Her Uncle Charles's words still rang in her ears, but she refused to let her son see the hurt that coiled in her chest. She unfolded a napkin, spread it across his lap, and spooned macaroni onto his plate, murmuring encouragement as he dug in hungrily. Around her, the laughter carried on, and though she tried to shut it out, it was impossible not to hear when her cousin Denise raised her voice just loud enough for half the hall to notice. "Y'all remember when Angela had to come begging for money just to buy diapers?" Denise's tone dripped with false sympathy, but the smirk tugging at her painted lips betrayed the cruelty. The room hushed for a beat, then erupted in snickers, some stifled behind hands, others open and gleeful. Denise, standing near the dessert table in her tailored black dress, lifted her chin as if she had scored a point in a game. "I gave her $20 out of pity," she went on, savoring the moment. "Told her she better pay me back, but I guess we all know how that story ends." Her words hung in the air, sharp and humiliating, each syllable reminding Angela of the night she had walked through rain with Isaiah, only weeks old, desperate and exhausted, knocking on Denise's door because her baby's crying wouldn't stop and the last diaper in the house was already used. She remembered the way Denise had handed over the bill reluctantly, her eyes full of judgment, and how Angela had promised through tears to repay her. The memory clawed at her now as her cousins laughed, using her desperation as sport. Angela swallowed hard, forcing herself not to respond, but Isaiah had stopped chewing, his fork clattering to the plate. "Mama, is that true?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Angela bent down, cupping his cheek, her heart aching at the shame in his eyes. "We got through it, baby," she whispered, her voice steady even as tears threatened to rise. "That's what matters." But the relatives weren't done. "She thinks she's somebody," another cousin muttered, shaking his head. "But she'll always be the one who came knocking for diapers." Their laughter rolled again, and Angela felt her chest tighten until it was hard to breathe. She wanted to leave, to take Isaiah home and shield him from this cruelty, but her grandfather's words rang in her memory, urging her to stand tall even when the world tried to cut her down. Before she could summon a response, the sound of a throat clearing silenced the room. Mr. Whitaker, the family lawyer, had stepped forward, his folder clasped tightly in his hands. He was an older white man with silver hair combed neatly back and glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his tailored suit crisp against the dim light of the fellowship hall. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Angela before addressing Denise directly. "You speak of that $20 as if it was a debt unpaid," he said, his voice calm but firm. Denise blinked, startled at being called out so openly. "Well, wasn't it?" She shot back, her tone defensive now. "Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, then opened the folder he carried. He pulled out a slim file, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying easily in the silence, "the record shows otherwise." He laid a sheet of paper on the table closest to him, and though only a few could see the details, his words filled in the rest. On May 14th, 7 years ago, Angela Johnson deposited $25 into an account registered under your name, Denise Parker. The original $20 was repaid in full, with $5 in interest, within 6 weeks of the loan. The bank statements confirm it. A murmur rippled through the room, whispers of surprise and confusion. Denise's face flushed red, her confidence collapsing as eyes turned toward her. "That's not possible," she stammered, her voice suddenly small. "I never saw any money." Mr. Whitaker raised a brow, his tone sharp. "Perhaps you never checked. The funds were transferred electronically to your account at First Southern Bank. I have the records right here, including the acknowledgement of receipt." He held up the paper, the official letterhead gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and the whispers grew louder, disbelief giving way to smirks directed not at Angela but at Denise. Angela sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. She had made that payment quietly, determined to keep her word, even when every dollar meant cutting meals short or walking to work to save gas. She had done it not for Denise, but for herself, to prove that she was no one's beggar, that she could keep her promises even in the darkest times. She had tucked away the confirmation slip for years, forgotten under the weight of daily survival, and now here it was, resurrected like a shield she hadn't known she still carried. Denise tried to recover, her words tumbling out. Well, even if she paid it back, she still begged in the first place. That's the point. She was still pitiful, but the sting of her words no longer carried. The room's attention had shifted, and the mocking glances had softened into something else, curiosity, perhaps even respect. Angela straightened her shoulders, her hand resting on Isaiah's, and for the first time that day she saw her son's eyes brighten, pride flickering in his young face. These were people who built their self-worth not on kindness or loyalty, but on hierarchy, on knowing who was above and who was beneath. They had long ago decided Angela was beneath, and they would not surrender that without a fight. Plates clattered as people shuffled back for seconds of sweet potato pie, but voices rose in little clusters, circling her name like vultures. Her Aunt Loretta, tall and imposing in a hat that seemed more suited for Easter Sunday than morning, stepped forward with deliberate grace. She carried herself like the matriarch she believed she was, even though everyone knew she had been absent through most of their grandfather's final years. Loretta placed her plate of food down and clasped her hands dramatically, drawing the attention of those nearby. "Now listen here," she said, her voice rich and commanding. "We all know the Johnson estate belongs to those who have kept the family's honor. We can't be handing over property to people who don't represent what this family stands for." Her eyes cut directly toward Angela, her painted smile thin and cold. "We all love you, Angela, but let's be real. You've made choices that took you out of step with what this family has built. A single mother with no husband to speak of, raising a child on her own, struggling from paycheck to paycheck, how can that represent the Johnson name? The land, the house, the legacy? It's not for everyone. It's for those of us who stood tall and upheld tradition." A murmur of agreement rippled through a few cousins, their nods sharp, their eyes glinting with satisfaction. Angela felt the sting, the insult woven carefully under the guise of concern. Her throat tightened, but before she could find words, Isaiah spoke up softly, his voice small but clear. "My mama stands tall." His words drew startled laughter, mocking chuckles echoing around the hall, and Loretta's smile widened as if the boy had proven her point. "Children speak from love, not understanding," she said with a chuckle. "But love doesn't build legacies. Discipline and honor do. This estate cannot pass to someone who abandoned it years ago." Angela's chest burned, not with shame, but with the same flame her grandfather had once kindled in her. She wanted to respond, to tell Loretta that honor was not measured in pearls and polished cars, but in the night she had worked 2 jobs to keep Isaiah fed, in the morning she had prayed for strength to keep moving forward, in the quiet promises she had kept, even when no one was watching. But before she could, Mr. Whitaker stepped forward again, his calm presence like a sudden gust clearing the suffocating air. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice even, "with all due respect, your understanding of this matter is incomplete." He opened his folder once more, the same leather-bound case that seemed to hold endless surprises, and withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded neatly with a notary's seal glinting in the fluorescent light. He smoothed it across the table and turned it outward so those closest could see. "This is a deed signed and filed by the late Mr. Johnson on March 12th of this year, several months before his passing. It transfers partial ownership of the family estate to Miss Angela Johnson, for the consideration of $1. Gasps broke through the room like glass shattering. Loretta's face drained of color, her composure faltering. "That's impossible," she snapped, her voice rising. "No such thing exists, Mr." Whitaker tapped the document with his forefinger, his eyes unyielding. "It exists here. It exists in the county records office, and it exists in the legal framework that governs this estate. Miss, Johnson is already by law a co-owner of the property you speak of." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in disbelief, protest, anger. Cousins crowded closer, trying to read the document, their eyes darting to Angela as though seeing her for the first time. Angela sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest, her mind struggling to catch up with the words. She remembered the last spring evening she had spent with her grandfather on the porch, the way he had taken her hand in his rough, callous grip and told her he wanted her to come home more often, to remember that this land was hers as much as anyone's. She thought he had meant it only in spirit, in sentiment, not in law, but now she realized he had meant every word literally. He had given her a piece of his world, a foundation she had never dared to believe she deserved. Loretta sputtered, trying to regain ground. He was old. He didn't know what he was signing. Somebody must have put him up to it. But Mr. Whitaker's tone sharpened like steel. "I was present when the document was executed, mister." Johnson read it carefully, asked questions, and signed of his own free will. The notary confirmed his sound mind and clear intent. There is no doubt this was his choice. The murmurs turned into open debate, relatives arguing among themselves, some still insisting it was a mistake, others whispering that perhaps the old man had seen something in Angela they had missed. Angela sat still, her pulse pounding, Isaiah leaning into her side with wide eyes. "Mama," he whispered, "does that mean we have a house?" Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let the relatives see her falter. She nodded slightly, her voice barely audible. "It means your great-granddaddy believed in us." The hall that had once been filled with whispers now swirled with raised voices and arguments after Mr. Whitaker placed the deed on the table, but the chaos only fueled the bitterness of those who refused to let Angela breathe in peace. Loretta's protest had been undercut by the lawyer's authority, but the shift in power made others even more determined to push Angela back down, to remind her of her supposed place at the bottom of the family chain. Angela sat with Isaiah beside her, her hand steady on his shoulder, her heart still racing from the revelation that her grandfather had already named her a co-owner of the estate. It was proof of his faith in her, and yet the atmosphere around her carried the promise of another attack. It came quicker than she expected from her cousin Rodney, a man who had always carried a smug grin and a slick tongue. He strutted toward the center of the room, tugging at the sleeves of his suit, his voice loud enough to gather attention. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, drawing the room's focus back from the deed to a smirk. "It's one thing to talk about giving her a share of the property, but we all know what this really means. If Angela gets her hands on this land, she'll pass it down to that boy of hers. And, let's be honest, that boy don't even have a proper father's name. He ain't legitimate. He ain't got a claim to a thing." The words hit Angela like a punch to the chest, not for her, but for the child sitting at her side. Isaiah's wide brown eyes filled with tears, his lips trembling as the laughter and sneers rippled through the room. Rodney folded his arms, his grin spreading as others chuckled, their nods echoing his cruelty. "Inheritance is about bloodlines," he continued, puffing his chest. "It's about carrying the Johnson name forward. That boy? He don't even know who is Daddy Island. He's no Johnson. He's nothing." Angela's blood boiled as she pulled Isaiah closer, her voice trembling with fury she struggled to control. "Don't you talk about my son like that," she said, her eyes locked on Rodney. But Rodney only laughed louder, turning to the crowd. "See? Even she can't say the boy belongs. She can't speak a father's name because there isn't one. And a bastard child ain't about to claim what real Johnson heirs built." The sting of his words cut deeper than any insult Angela had endured that day. Not because they were true, but because they sought to reduce her son to nothing, to shame him for circumstances he had no hand in creating. Isaiah buried his face in her sleeve, his small body trembling, and Angela felt her chest tighten with a mix of rage and helplessness. She opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could find the words, Mr. Whitaker's voice rose again, firm and steady. That's enough." The lawyer's sharp tone cut through the laughter, silencing the room. He opened his folder with deliberate care, pulling out another document thicker than the last, its official seal gleaming under the light. His eyes fixed on Rodney, cold and unwavering. "You question the legitimacy of this child," he said, his voice measured, "but your accusations hold no weight against legal recognition, mister." Johnson anticipated this very cruelty and took steps to ensure it would have no bearing on his grandson's future. He laid the papers on the table, smoothing them flat with his hand. "These are court documents signed and notarized 5 years ago. In them, mister." Johnson formally recognized young Isaiah Johnson as his legal grandson, with all rights and privileges that status carries. He filed them with the county court, and they remain part of the permanent record. This child is, in the eyes of the law, no less a Johnson than any of you standing here. A wave of gasps filled the room, the disbelief palpable. Relatives craned their necks to glimpse the official seal, the signatures, the undeniable proof. Rodney's grin faltered, his face flushing as the weight of the revelation pressed down. "That can't be," he sputtered, his voice cracking. He wouldn't do that." "Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, his voice sharp. "He did, and I was there when he signed. He looked me in the eye and said, 'This boy is mine in every way that matters.' No one will tell him otherwise." The words hung in the air, heavy with authority, and the silence that followed was deafening. Angela felt tears well in her eyes, not from pain this time, but from vindication. She turned to Isaiah, brushing a hand over his cheek as he peeked up at her, confusion mingling with relief. "You hear that, baby?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Great. Granddaddy made sure you're part of this family. No one can take that away." Isaiah's lips curved into the smallest smile, his chest lifting with a pride he had never felt before. The relatives, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Angela and the lawyer, unsure of how to respond now that the cruelest weapon they had wielded had been stripped from their hands. Rodney tried to recover, his words stumbling. "So what? He signed some papers? That don't change the truth. Blood is blood." But his protest sounded weak, hollow against the official stamp of the court and the undeniable intent of their grandfather. "Mr." Whitaker closed the folder with a snap, his gaze sweeping the room. "Blood may bind you, Mr. Parker, but love and law bind this boy, and both weigh heavier than your spite." The hush that followed felt like a turning tide, the power shifting again as Angela's supposed weakness became strength, as her son's worth was confirmed in a way no mockery could erase. Angela held Isaiah close, her own spine straighter now, her voice steady when she finally spoke to the room. "My son has a name," she said firmly. "His name is Isaiah Johnson, and he will never be made to feel like he doesn't belong again." The room fell quiet, some relatives avoiding her gaze, others whispering nervously, but none dared laugh. For the first time since she walked into that church, Angela felt the weight of her grandfather's love pressing not as a burden, but as a shield. He had seen the battle she would face, and he had prepared her for them even in his absence. And though the fight was not over, one truth had been carved in stone: neither she nor her son could be erased from the Johnson legacy. Her brother, Darnell, who had always walked with the air of a man who believed his mere presence commanded authority, stepped forward then, his tie loosened, his jaw tight. He was one of the eldest among the cousins, a man who had long claimed to be the true torchbearer of the Johnson line, though his life had been marked more by failed businesses and broken promises than by actual achievements. He crossed his arms and let his gaze rest on Angela, his tone dripping with disdain. "You may have papers saying your boy is recognized," he said slowly, letting each word hang in the air, "but we all know recognition don't make you family. You weren't there when it mattered. You weren't around this estate when he needed people close. You left. You built your own little life somewhere else, and you barely came back. You can't claim to be the rightful heir when you abandoned him for years." The words hit Angela with a sting sharper than the others, because beneath the cruelty there was a kernel of truth. She had moved away for a time, forced to survive on her own when her marriage collapsed, working long hours in a small-town apartment, raising Isaiah alone, too embarrassed and too exhausted to make frequent visits. There had been years when she felt she had lost her place in the family entirely, when the shame of struggling with bills and loneliness kept her from facing the sharp eyes of her relatives. Darnell knew this, and now he wielded it like a weapon. He turned to the others, spreading his arms as though addressing a jury. I was here, we were here. We kept this family home alive. She chose her own path, and it wasn't this one. That's not loyalty, that's abandonment. Murmurs rose, nods followed, and Angela felt her chest tighten with the weight of old guilt. She thought of nights she had cried alone, clutching Isaiah to her, wishing she had the strength to come back more often, wishing she didn't feel so small under the judgment she always faced. But before she could find her voice, Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat again, his calm presence cutting through the swell of voices like a steady drumbeat. He opened his folder, his hands deliberate, his eyes sharp. Mr. Johnson, he said, addressing Darnell directly, your accusations ring hollow in light of the actual records. He pulled out a thick set of papers, bound together with a metal clip, the hospital logo printed clearly at the top of each page. These are medical records and caretaker logs from the final 3 years of Mr. Johnson's life. They detail every visit, every signature, every family member who did or did not step forward to assist. He flipped through the pages, his voice firm and unyielding. I see no record of you, Darnell, signing in at the hospital, not once. I see no signatures from many of those who stand here claiming to have been present. But do you know whose name appears again and again? He turned the pages toward the crowd, his finger tapping the highlighted lines. Angela Johnson. Every week, every month, she signed in. She was there at his bedside, helping the nurses, advocating for his care, paying bills when insurance faltered, and ensuring he was never alone. Gasps rippled through the hall, whispers cutting across the silence as relatives leaned in to glimpse the evidence. Angela's name stood in bold letters across the pages, dates and times, marking her steady presence. Darnell's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for an excuse. But Mr. Whitaker continued without pause. She did not abandon him. She was his caretaker, his advocate, his family when others were too busy or too proud to show up. These records are notarized, official, and indisputable. They paint a picture not of abandonment but of loyalty that surpasses anything the rest of you can claim. Angela felt her throat tighten as tears burned behind her eyes. She had not known the hospital had kept such detailed records. She remembered those long nights sitting beside her grandfather's bed, holding his hand while machines beeped steadily, whispering prayers while Isaiah drew pictures on scrap paper to cheer him. She remembered the exhaustion, the hours taken from work, the meals skipped to pay for gas, and the way she had told herself none of it mattered as long as he was not alone. She had carried those moments quietly, never seeking credit, never expecting acknowledgement, but now they stood written in black and white, undeniable proof of her devotion. Darnell's voice rose, weak and faltering. She might have visited, but she didn't carry the weight of this estate. She didn't, Mr. Whitaker's tone sharpened. She carried the weight of a man's final years, and Mr. Johnson knew it. In his words, recorded in these documents, he named her his greatest comfort in my last days. The room went still, the weight of the lawyer's words pressing down like a stone. Angela sat in stunned silence, Isaiah pressing closer to her side, whispering, Mama, you really did all that. She stroked his hair, her heart heavy with emotion. I just loved him, baby. That's all I did. The arguments in the fellowship hall shifted from Darnell's failed accusations of abandonment to hurried conversations about land and money, as if the revelation of Angela's devotion during their grandfather's final years had only made the prize seem more urgent in their minds. Angela sat quietly with Isaiah, her arm draped protectively around him, while the weight of the hospital record still echoed in her chest. She had endured ridicule and humiliation, but at every turn the lawyer's documents had lifted her back to her feet. And yet she could feel in the uneasy silence and the hard stares that the battle was far from over. The relatives were not ready to accept her as an heir, much less as someone whose name already carried part ownership of the estate. They searched desperately for another angle, another way to strip her of legitimacy, to cling to the sense of superiority they had always held over her. That angle came when Cousin Melvin, a tall man with slick back hair and a gold watch that flashed whenever he moved his hand, stepped forward carrying a small leather folder of his own. He slapped it on the table with a flourish, his grin wide, his confidence returning like a storm surge. Y'all been going on about records and visits and recognition, But let's not forget what really matters, he said loudly, his voice carrying through the hall. I've got the property deeds right here. The original ones, signed and sealed, showing that the Johnson estate belongs to us who kept it alive all these years. My father held them and now they're in my hands. That's proof. And no piece of paper Whitaker waves around changes that. He opened the folder dramatically, pulling out old yellow documents with signatures and seals faded with age. The crowd leaned in, murmurs of approval rising as Melvin spread the papers out. These deeds prove the land belongs to this side of the family, he boasted, tapping his finger on the brittle parchment. Angela may have been caretaker, she may have been sentimental, but property don't move without deeds, and the deeds are right here. Angela's heart sank for a moment, the whispers of agreement stirring around the room, the looks of dismissal returning to faces that had just moments ago been softened by guilt. Isaiah pressed against her side, his eyes wide with fear as though sensing the shift. She wanted to reassure him, but her throat tightened with the weight of old memories. Memories of being told she had nothing, of being dismissed because she lacked the documents, the power, the standing. For a moment, it felt as if all the progress had been erased, the voices of scorn rising again to crush her. But Mr. Whitaker did not flinch. His face remained calm, his eyes sharp as he closed his own folder with deliberate care and stepped closer to the table. Mr. Melvin, he said smoothly, his tone respectful but laced with steel. What you hold are indeed original deeds. They were correct at the time they were issued. But deeds, like lives, change with time. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a small brass key attached to a tag with the number of a local bank branch. The room fell silent, curiosity flickering through the anger as Whitaker held the key up. 6 months before his death, Mr. Johnson requested that I accompany him to First State Bank, he continued. There he deposited updated legal documents in a safety deposit box under my joint custodianship. These documents were not made public until today. With the court's permission, I retrieved them yesterday. He placed a small black case on the table, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet hall as he opened it. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, their edges crisp, their seals unbroken. He drew out the topmost folder, the weight of authority clear in its thick cover and official stamps. These are the updated property deeds, he said, his voice carrying the gravity of finality. Filed, notarized, and registered. They supersede any prior documents, including the ones you hold, Melvin. He opened the folder and spread the deeds across the table, the ink fresh, the seals bold. At the top of each page, in unmistakable print, was the name, Angela Johnson. The room gasped, the sound of disbelief rising like a wave. Angela's eyes widened, her breath catching as she stared at her name printed on documents she had never seen. Documents that declared her the rightful owner of land she had once been mocked for even dreaming about. Isaiah tugged at her sleeve, his voice trembling with awe. Mama, that's your name. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, Yes, baby. That's my name. Melvin's face turned crimson as he scrambled for words, clutching the old documents in his hand as if they could still shield him from the truth. Those can't be real, he stammered, his voice cracking. They must be forged. No way he'd do that without telling us. Whitaker's eyes narrowed, his tone cutting like glass. They are real, and they are registered with the county clerk. I hold certified copies. You may deny it, but the law will not. And I was there, in that bank, when Mr. Johnson signed them with full knowledge and intent. He said, and I quote, I want Angela to have the foundation I built because she understands what it cost me to build it. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air heavy with the collapse of the relatives' confidence. Angela sat frozen, her mind whirling with disbelief and gratitude, her heart pounding as she tried to grasp the reality that her grandfather had trusted her so deeply, had given her something she never thought she could claim. The room filled with whispers, some shocked, some resentful, some grudgingly impressed. Melvin tried to rally, holding up the old deeds with a shaking hand. These were the real ones, he insisted weakly, but the weight of the new documents crushed his protest, and the lawyer's unflinching gaze left him no escape. Angela placed her hand over Isaiah's, her shoulders square, her heart steady for the first time in years. She realized now that her grandfather had seen the battles coming, had prepared for them, had left behind proof after proof to protect her from the family's scorn. And though the fight was not over, the ground beneath her feet had shifted permanently. She was not the charity case they laughed at, not the single mother they dismissed. She was Angela Johnson, co-owner of the land her grandfather had bled to build, her name carved into deeds no one could take away. And as she lifted her head, meeting the furious eyes of her relatives, she knew they understood it too. The shock of seeing Angela's name on the updated deeds still hung in the air when the murmurs began to harden again into sharp whispers, the relatives searching desperately for a new weapon to cut her down. Melvin had been silenced, his old papers worthless against the freshly notarized titles, and yet the stubborn pride of the Johnson clan refused to yield. Angela sat steady with Isaiah at her side, her fingers trembling only slightly as she smoothed the edge of her dress, but she knew the moment of peace would not last. Their eyes circled her like wolves, each relative nursing their bruised pride, each one desperate to prove she was unworthy of the inheritance her grandfather had secured for her. That desperation finally found its voice in her half-sister Evelyn, a woman whose bitterness had always run deeper than her perfume and pearls could mask. Evelyn stepped forward, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, her lips twisted into a smile that carried no warmth. She had been silent until now, content to watch the others take their swings. But the sight of Angela's name on those deeds clearly stirred something toxic inside her. She lifted her chin, her voice sharp and theatrical. "You all keep forgetting who this woman really is," Evelyn declared, her words cutting through the chatter and silencing the room. "You want to talk about loyalty, about devotion? Let's revisit history, shall we? Angela wasn't always so devoted. In fact, she was thrown out of this very house years ago for shaming the family. Don't y'all remember? She got herself in trouble, brought disgrace to our name, and Granddaddy told her to leave. We all saw it, we all heard it. And now you expect us to believe he wanted her to inherit the very home he kicked her out of?" Gasps and murmurs erupted, heads nodding as the memory surfaced in fragments. The story of Angela's departure twisted over the years until it had become legend. Angela felt the blood drain from her face, her throat tightening as the shame of that night came rushing back. She remembered the shouting, the accusations, the way Evelyn had stood at the top of the stairs with triumph in her eyes, while Angela, barely 20, clutched Isaiah as a baby and fled into the night with nothing but a bag of clothes. She had never forgotten the sting of her grandfather's harsh words spoken in anger, words she had thought were final, words that had convinced her for years that she was no longer wanted. Evelyn's voice grew sharper, her triumph swelling as she pressed on. She left and stayed gone. Don't tell me she was some faithful daughter. She was cast out because she disgraced us, and she never came back until she wanted something. That's who Angela Island. That's who she's always been. The laughter and nods swelled again, the relatives emboldened by Evelyn's accusation, and Angela felt her heart splinter under the weight of old wounds. Isaiah looked up at her, confusion clouding his young face, whispering, "Mama, is that true?" Angela swallowed hard, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "Not the way she says it, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Not the way she says it." Before the wave of shame could consume her, Mr. Whitaker stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence rising once again like a shield. He placed his briefcase on the table, his movements slow and deliberate, and addressed Evelyn directly. "You speak of Angela's departure as if it were abandonment or disgrace," he said, his voice steady. "But as with many family stories, what was remembered has been twisted, while the truth was quietly recorded." He reached into his case and withdrew a small device, a digital recorder worn with age, and set it on the table. The sight of it silenced the hall, curiosity replacing cruelty for a brief moment. Whitaker pressed a button, and the faint crackle of static filled the air before a familiar voice emerged, rough and aged but strong. It was the voice of their grandfather, unmistakable in its tone, its cadence. "Angela," the voice said, carrying through the room with haunting clarity. "I know I was too hard on you that night. I let anger speak where love should have. You never shamed me. You never betrayed me. You were the only one who came back when I called, the only one who stood by me when others turned away. You are my blood, my strength, and I want you home. Don't let their words drive you off again. This is your place as much as anyone's." The room went utterly still, every head turning toward the recorder as the words sank in. The relatives who had nodded eagerly at Evelyn's accusations now looked at each other uneasily, their certainty crumbling under the undeniable sound of their grandfather's voice. Angela sat frozen, tears spilling freely now as the memory of that reconciliation surged back. She remembered the day months after she had fled, when her grandfather had called her quietly, asking her to return, telling her he had been wrong to drive her away. She had gone back to him then, slowly, cautiously, and though she had never forgotten the pain of that first night, she had also never forgotten the softness in his eyes when he welcomed her back. Isaiah's small hand squeezed hers tightly, his voice trembling with wonder. "Mama, that's great. Granddaddy." Angela nodded, her tears streaming. "Yes, baby, that's him." Evelyn's face blanched, her confidence shattering as the relatives turned on her with whispers of disapproval. "You lied," someone muttered. "You left that part out." "She twisted the story," another said. Evelyn stammered, her face red, her voice faltering. He must have been confused. He didn't know what he was saying." But Whitaker shook his head firmly. "That recording was made 2 years ago in my office with full clarity of mind. Mr. Johnson asked me to preserve it in case his wishes were ever questioned. His words are final. Angela was not cast out. She was invited back. She was, in his own words, the only one who never betrayed him. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, the weight of the truth pressing down on every corner of the room. Angela wiped her tears, her chest lifting with both pain and pride. She had carried the scars of that night for years, believing the story her family had repeated, but now her grandfather's voice had restored her truth. She was not the disgrace Evelyn painted her to be. She was his chosen, his blood, his strength. She looked at Isaiah, his eyes wide with awe, and whispered, "He never gave up on us." And in that moment, for the first time since walking into the church that morning, she felt the shame of her past dissolve, replaced by the unshakable certainty that her grandfather had always believed in her, even when no one else did. The sound of their grandfather's voice echoing through the hall still lingered in Angela's ears, his words playing over and over like a balm against years of wounds. He had declared her the only one who never betrayed him, and for the first time the family's accusations had begun to crumble under the weight of truth that could not be denied. The silence that followed Evelyn's humiliation carried a strange heaviness, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to speak, for another spark of defiance to ignite the fire that had threatened Angela since the moment she walked in. She sat with Isaiah pressed close against her, her tears drying on her cheeks, her body trembling from the release of emotions she had carried too long, but her spirit felt steadier than it had in years. She had been mocked, accused, shamed, and dismissed, yet each attack had been met with undeniable proof that her grandfather had chosen her, trusted her, and loved her. And still, she knew this family too well to believe they would stop. Their pride, their hunger, their resentment would not let them surrender, and so she braced herself as she saw another figure step forward. It was her older cousin Harold, a man in his 50s who had always carried himself with the air of superiority, his suits more expensive than most could afford, his voice sharp with the certainty of someone who believed money defined truth. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and let out a dry chuckle that drew eyes toward him. "We're all getting carried away here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Y'all act like this woman is some kind of saint. Let's not forget what she really was. She wasn't family, she was a paid caretaker. She sat by his bed not out of loyalty, but because she was getting something out of it. You think all those visits were charity? Please. She was no different than a nurse clocking in and out. That's the truth, and y'all know it." His words stung not just because of the insult, but because of how casually he stripped Angela's sacrifices of meaning. Years of long nights, skipped meals, and aching bones were reduced to the cold transaction of labor in his voice, as though her love could be dismissed as wages. A murmur of agreement flickered through some of the relatives, their bitterness finding comfort in Harold's words, their eyes narrowing at Angela as if she were suddenly a fraud exposed. Isaiah looked up at her with panic in his eyes, whispering, "Mama, is that true?" Her throat tightened, her chest burning with anger. "No, baby," she said softly, her voice trembling. "That's not the truth." But Harold pressed on, his grin widening as he sensed the shift. "See how she squirms? She wasn't here because she loved him, she was here because it paid. That's all." And now she wants to use that to steal what rightfully belongs to the family who actually carried the name with honor. Angela's fists clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to shout down his lies, to tell them about the bills she had paid out of her own empty pockets, about the night she had cried herself to sleep at her grandfather's bedside, about the sacrifices she had made with no promise of anything in return. But her voice caught in her throat, the years of mockery and dismissal pressing down like a weight she could not lift. Just as the laughter began to rise again, Mr. Whitaker's calm baritone cut through the noise like a blade. "You question her motives," he said evenly, his eyes fixed on Harold, "but you speak without knowledge." He set his briefcase on the table again, opening it with deliberate care, and withdrew a thin tablet computer. The glow of his screen illuminated his face as he tapped quickly, pulling up a file he had prepared for just this moment. Before his passing, Whitaker continued, "Mr. Johnson gave explicit instructions to record his statements about those who visited him, about their intentions, and about who he trusted. These recordings were made at the hospital, under the supervision of medical staff. They are time-stamped, verified, and admissible as testimony." He set the tablet on the table, pressing play, and the room filled with the sight and sound of their grandfather lying in his hospital bed. His face aged, but his eyes still sharp, his voice steady despite the strain in his chest. "People will try to say Angela was here for money," the old man said, his voice echoing with clarity. "But that's a lie. Angela was never paid. She came because she loved me. She came when no one else did. She gave when she had nothing to give, and she never asked for a dime. She is my family, not my employee, not my caretaker. She is my blood, my heart, and the only one I trust to carry this home forward." The room froze, the sound of his voice undeniable, the image of his tired but resolute face burning into every eye. The murmurs died instantly, the laughter silenced, the smugness wiped clean. Harold's face went pale, his confidence draining as quickly as it had flared. That could be faked," he stammered, but his words sounded hollow, unconvincing even to himself. Whitaker's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp as steel. "These files are watermarked by the hospital, time-stamped by the devices used, and certified by 2 independent witnesses. They are beyond dispute. You may choose not to believe, but the law will." Angela sat trembling, tears spilling freely now as she clutched Isaiah to her, his little arms wrapping tightly around her neck. "See, Mama," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "Great. Granddaddy knew. He knew you loved him." She nodded, her voice breaking. "He knew, baby. He always knew." The silence in the room deepened, shame flickering across the faces of those who had joined Harold in his mockery. They had spent years dismissing her sacrifices, years convincing themselves that love was measured by appearances, by wealth, by status, but now the truth stared back at them from the glowing screen, undeniable and final. Their grandfather had spoken not in vague sentiments, but in clear, recorded words. Angela was his family, his blood, his heart. Harold tried to recover, his voice rising again, but the weight of the testimony crushed him. No one nodded now, no one laughed, no one joined his side. The power he had wielded with his condescension was gone, stripped bare by the voice of the man they all claimed to honor. Angela wiped her tears, her shoulders squaring as she looked around the room. She had endured every insult, every attempt to erase her, but her grandfather's truth had resurrected her dignity piece by piece. And now, though the fight was not over, she felt her strength rising. She was not their servant, not their scapegoat, not their caretaker for hire. She was Angela Johnson, his chosen heir, his true family. The echo of the video testimony still hung in the room. The image of their grandfather's face etched into every mind, his words defending Angela as his family and not his employee ringing too loud for even the boldest cousin to ignore. For a long moment, no one spoke, the silence filled only with the sound of shuffling feet and whispered breaths. But Angela knew her relatives too well to think the battle had ended there. Pride and envy burned too hot in them, and she could feel their eyes circling her again, searching for another weakness, another accusation to wield like a knife. She sat straighter with Isaiah pressed against her side, her tears drying into steely resolve, her voice still trembling, but her spirit stronger than ever. Each twist of cruelty had been answered with truth, and each truth had been her shield, but she braced herself knowing the next strike was inevitable. It came from Cousin Trina, a woman known as much for her sharp tongue as her carefully curated image of success. Trina stepped forward in her stiletto heels, her pearl necklace glittering under the fluorescent lights, her expression one of smug certainty. She let out a laugh, the kind meant to draw attention, and spread her manicured hands wide as if presenting a case to the entire hall. "Y'all can bring out all the recordings and papers you want," she said loudly, her eyes narrowing on Angela. "But we all know why she's really here. Let's stop pretending this is about loyalty or family. Angela wants that inheritance because she's broke. She's drowning in debt. She's been struggling her whole life, living off scraps, and now she thinks this estate is her golden ticket. That's the truth, and everyone in this room knows it." The words struck deep because they were crafted from the surface of reality, from years of Angela working 2 jobs, scrimping and saving, driving her rusted sedan while her relatives flaunted new cars. Heads began to nod, murmurs of agreement spreading quickly. "She's always been broke," someone whispered. "She needs this money. She never had nothing, so of course she's grabbing for it now," another added. Angela's chest burned as the shame rose again, hot and suffocating. She thought of the night she had sat at her kitchen table with bills spread out before her, trying to decide which one could wait, which one she could pay late without the light shutting off. She thought of the meal she had skipped so Isaiah could eat, of the time she had walked to work because gas money was gone. Those struggles had been real, and hearing them twisted into proof of greed clawed at her. Isaiah looked up at her, confusion clouding his young face. "Mama, are we broke?" he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. Angela swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "We've had hard times, baby," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean we're nothing." Trina seized the moment, her smile widening as she saw the doubt flicker in Angela's eyes. "See? Even she admits it. She wants this because it's her only chance. She doesn't care about Granddaddy's legacy, she just wants the money to cover her sorry life." The laughter began again, cruel and sharp, but before Angela could find the strength to respond, Mr. Whitaker stepped forward once more, his calm presence filling the room like a gavel striking silence into a courtroom. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed firmly on Trina, and opened his briefcase with deliberate care. "You claim Miss Johnson is here out of desperation," he said, his tone sharp but controlled, "but your claim collapses against the facts, as every other accusation has. Mr. Johnson anticipated this as well, and he took steps to ensure that no one could mistake Angela's presence here as greed. He pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax and broke it open, withdrawing a set of documents that gleamed with official stamps and signatures. "6 years ago," Whitaker continued, "Mr. Johnson invested in a small logistics company that has since grown into a thriving regional enterprise. At the time of his investment, he instructed that 25% of the company's shares be placed in Angela Johnson's name, without her knowledge, as a safeguard for her and her son's future. The company is now valued at over $8 million, and her shares alone are worth $2 million. Gasps exploded across the room, the sound of disbelief and shock reverberating like thunder. Angela's head snapped toward the lawyer, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her chest. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Whitaker gave her a small nod, his tone softening. "It's true, Miss Johnson. You are already a shareholder. Dividends have been reinvested annually, and the account tied to your name holds more than enough to prove that you are financially secure. In fact, you are wealthier than most of the relatives in this room combined." The hall erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in outrage and astonishment. "That's not fair," someone shouted. "She didn't earn that." "Why her?" another cried, their voice dripping with jealousy. Angela sat frozen, her mind reeling, her heart pounding as she tried to comprehend the weight of the revelation. She thought of all the years she had scraped by, believing herself forgotten, unworthy, invisible, only to discover that her grandfather had been watching, preparing, investing in her future behind the scenes. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Isaiah to her, whispering, "He never stopped looking out for us." Isaiah beamed, pride lighting his face as he whispered back, "Mama, we're not broke. We're not broke anymore." The murmurs grew louder, fury mingling with disbelief as relatives processed the truth. Trina's face twisted, her confidence crumbling as she sputtered for words. That can't be real. She didn't even know. How can she own shares she didn't know about? Whitaker's gaze was unyielding, his voice cutting through the noise. Because her grandfather wanted it so, he trusted her with his legacy, not with her cousins who mocked and abandoned him. He believed in her, invested in her, and ensured that her future and her sons would never again depend on the approval of this family. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with resentment and awe. Angela's shoulders straightened, her tears drying as a new sense of dignity filled her chest. She was not the charity case they had painted her, not the desperate beggar clinging to scraps. She was a woman her grandfather had trusted with his wealth, his land, and his legacy. And though her relatives seethed with envy, she knew they could no longer dismiss her as broke, as nothing, as less than them. She had been lifted above their lives by the truth her grandfather had left behind. The fellowship hall had become a storm of envy and disbelief after Whitaker revealed Angela's shares in the logistics company, the relatives furious that she, the one they had mocked and dismissed, was already wealthier than most of them combined. They paced, they whispered, they snapped at each other, but beneath it all burned one final hope, one last desperate card they clung to with white-knuckled determination. No matter the deeds, no matter the shares, no matter the recognition of Isaiah or the records of Angela's devotion, they believed the will itself would restore the balance in their favor. They told themselves their father, their grandfather, their brother would never dare give away everything to the one woman they had all agreed to despise. And so when Cousin Lillian, her voice sharp with indignation, shouted above the noise, "Enough of this, read the will, let's see what he really wanted," the hall erupted in cheers and nods, their voices unified in their demand. Angela sat still, her hand resting on Isaiah's shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. She had endured every attack, every accusation, and every attempt to erase her, only to see each one crumble under the truth her grandfather had left behind. But the will, that final word of his life, was something she had never dared to imagine in her favor. She clutched Isaiah closer, whispering a prayer under her breath, bracing herself for whatever truth lay in Whitaker's hands. The lawyer nodded slowly, his face calm, his movements deliberate as he retrieved a large envelope from his briefcase, its seal unbroken, the handwriting on its face unmistakably their grandfather's. The room fell silent as Whitaker held it up, his voice steady. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Henry Johnson, dated 8 months prior to his death, witnessed and notarized in accordance with state law. Its contents are final and binding." He broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and began to read, his voice filling the hall. "To my family, I leave not only my name, but the lessons I hope you will remember. For years, I have watched pride eat at the love that once bound us, and I have seen cruelty replace compassion. But I have also seen one among you who never stopped showing up, who never stopped loving even when she was mocked, who gave when she had nothing to give. To Angela Johnson, my granddaughter, I leave the Johnson estate in its entirety, including the land, the house, and all assets tied to it. I also leave to her my shares in the family trust, the savings accounts, and all personal possessions of value. To her son Isaiah, I leave my name, my blessing, and my hope that he will grow knowing his worth, never doubting he belongs. To the rest of you, I leave my prayers that you learn what legacy truly means. It is not money, it is not land. It is love, sacrifice, and faith. If you cannot see that, then my estate would do nothing but harm in your hands. Let Angela lead by example." The words fell like thunder, echoing in the stunned silence of the hall. Gasps, groans, and cries broke out, voices overlapping in outrage and disbelief. "All of it?" someone shouted. "That can't be right," another cried. "She doesn't deserve it." But the paper in Whitaker's hands carried the weight of law, and no amount of shouting could undo it. Angela sat frozen, her chest tight with shock, tears spilling down her cheeks as Isaiah clutched her arm. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe, "he left it all to us." She nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, baby." He did. The hall descended into chaos, relatives shouting, some storming out, others collapsing into chairs with disbelief. But Whitaker's calm voice cut through once more. "The will is signed, witnessed, and binding. There can be no dispute." He placed a letter gently on the table and looked directly at Angela. "He chose you because you earned it, not with wealth, not with titles, but with love. Angela rose slowly, her shoulders squared, her heart heavy but steady. She looked around the room at the faces twisted with anger, envy, and resentment, and though part of her wanted to shout, to throw their cruelty back at them, she found her voice rising with something else: dignity. "You all laughed at me," she said firmly, her voice carrying through the hall. "You mocked me, you mocked my son, you called me names, you tried to erase me. But he saw me. He saw every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment you turned your backs. And he chose me, not because I'm perfect, but because I showed up when it mattered." You talk about legacy like it's money, like it's cars, like it's pride. But legacy is love. Legacy is sacrifice. Legacy is showing up. That's what he wanted you to see. And if you can't, then no land, no house, no will would ever fix it. The hall was silent again, her words heavy in the air, the truth undeniable. Isaiah held her hand, his eyes shining with pride, and in that moment, Angela felt the weight of years of scorn lift from her shoulders. She was no longer the charity case, no longer the single mother dismissed as unworthy. She was the heir, the chosen, the legacy bearer of Henry Johnson, and she carried not just the estate, but the meaning of it, the truth he had left behind for all of them. As she walked out of the hall with Isaiah by her side, the lawyer's folder under his arm, the voices of protest fading behind her, she knew this was not an ending, but a beginning. She would honor her grandfather not with pride or cruelty, but with compassion, with perseverance, with the strength that had carried her this far. She would teach Isaiah that his worth was never measured by their laughter, but by his love, his dignity, and his resilience. The family estate was hers, but the greater inheritance was the truth. No one could define her except herself, and no one could erase the legacy of love that had been entrusted to her. The end. Thank you for staying with me through Angela's journey. Stories like this are more than just drama inside a family. They remind us how resilience and dignity can break through years of cruelty and reveal the power of love as the true inheritance. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one I share. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Angela's fight for her rightful place struck you the hardest? Was it when the lawyer produced the deed, the recording, or the will itself? And tell me, where are you watching from right now? Your comments bring this community together, and I can't wait to read them.